The rain wasn't just falling that night, it was attacking. It hammered against the windshield of my worn-out Honda with a fury that matched the frantic beating of my own heart. I could barely see the familiar, winding road to my parents' house, the same road I'd driven 1,000 times, but tonight it felt alien, treacherous. Each drop of water streaking across the glass was like a tear I didn't have time to cry. I burst through the heavy oak double doors of their Tudor-style home without bothering to knock. The evening air, thick with the scent of wet earth and my own panic, clung to my rain-soaked hair. For a moment, the light from the massive crystal chandelier in the foyer was blinding, a galaxy of tiny, sharp stars exploding in my vision. I stumbled, my worn sneakers squeaking shamefully on the polished marble floor, a sound that felt like a judgment in this house of quiet opulence. My swollen eyes scanned the crowded room. It was a sea of tailored suits, silk dresses, and pearls. Champagne glasses clinked, a delicate, tinkling sound against the backdrop of a string quartet playing something classical and serene. It was a world away from the sterile, beeping nightmare I had just escaped. It was my brother Ethan's engagement party. My mother, Eleanor, spotted me first. Her practiced hostess smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, froze on her lips. It didn't just falter, it shattered, melting into a tight-lipped grimace of pure annoyance. She excused herself from a cluster of what I assumed were important local figures gliding toward me in her navy silk dress. The pearls at her throat gleamed like cold white eyes. "Amanda, not now," she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that cut through the music. Her perfectly manicured hand, adorned with a diamond that could have paid for a semester of college, gripped my elbow. The pressure was surprisingly strong. "We have guests. Whatever this is, it can wait." This, she called the terror that was clawing my insides out, this. My father, Richard, appeared at her side, a silent, imposing shadow. His jaw was clenched beneath his silver-flecked beard, the same jaw I saw tighten whenever a business deal went south. He glanced over his shoulder at the curious onlookers, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Let's take this somewhere private," he muttered, steering me toward his study. The heavy oak door closed behind us with a solid, definitive thud, sealing us off from the party. The silence in the room was suddenly deafening, broken only by the sound of water dripping from my cheap raincoat onto the priceless Persian rug. My mother's eyes followed each droplet as if I were bleeding on a museum artifact. I stood there, trembling, the words caught in my throat like shards of glass. "Lily collapsed at school today," I finally managed, my voice breaking on her name. "They rushed her to Portland Memorial." My father shifted his weight from one expensive leather shoe to the other. "Is she all right?" "No." The word hung in the air between us, small and heavy and terrible. "She has a congenital heart defect. The doctor said, without surgery in the next 48 hours, I couldn't finish. The unthinkable was a physical presence in the room, sucking the air from my lungs." My mother's hand fluttered to her chest in a gesture that was more theatrical than sincere. "Oh dear, well, surely your insurance." "I don't have insurance right now," I whispered, the shame burning my cheeks. "The business has been struggling. I was going to enroll next month when the new client payment came through." My father's face hardened. That was the look I knew, the look of a businessman assessing a bad investment. "How much?" $95,000. I forced the words out. They tasted like ash. "I've tried everything. The hospital payment plan only covers a fraction. The bank won't approve an emergency loan without collateral. I don't have any collateral." My knees gave out. I sank onto that Persian rug, something I swore I would never do in front of them again. The desperation was a physical weight, pressing me down. "I've never asked you for anything," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Not when Mark lost his job, not when our roof leaked, not when I needed startup funds for my design business. Please." My hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the perfectly pressed fabric of my mother's slacks. "Please, help save her. She's your granddaughter." My father's eyes darted toward my mother. A silent conversation passed between them, a language I had witnessed my entire life but had never been taught. I saw my mother's shoulders drop slightly, a flicker of something that might have been regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "We simply can't, Amanda," she said, her voice regaining its composure. "Ethan's wedding is in 3 months. We've already committed to covering the costs." My mind reeled. What costs? What could possibly? "Always trying to steal my spotlight, sis." The voice, dripping with smug amusement, cut through the tension. Ethan was leaning against the doorframe, a champagne flute dangling casually between his fingers. His fiancée, Chloe, hovered behind him, her enormous diamond ring catching the light, winking at me like a cruel star. "Not now, Ethan," I started, but my father interrupted. "We've already put down $250,000 for the venue, the catering, and the honeymoon package," he explained, his tone level, as if discussing a quarterly report. "Non-refundable deposits." $250,000. The number echoed in the silent, wood-paneled room. For a party. My mind flashed back to the hospital room I had left just an hour ago. Lily's small body, swallowed by the sterile white sheets, the oxygen mask fogging with each of her labored breaths, the crayon drawing clutched in her tiny hand, stick figures she had labeled Mommy, Daddy, me, Grandma, and Grandpa. I drove home through that same attacking rain, but I no longer felt it. A strange, cold numbness had settled deep in my bones, a protective layer of ice forming over my shattered heart. The world outside my car was a blur of weeping lights and slick, black asphalt. Inside, there was only the echo of my father's words, non-refundable deposits. My husband, David, met me at the door. One look at my face and his own crumpled. He didn't need to ask. He just wrapped his strong arms around me and held me as the sobs I had suppressed in my parents' study finally broke free, raw and ragged. He was the opposite of my family's cold marble. He was solid oak, weathered and warm and unshakable. "We'll figure it out," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "We always do." But as the night wore on, his promise began to feel hollow. Not through any fault of his own, but because of the sheer, insurmountable size of the mountain we had to climb. We sat at our small kitchen table, the one with the slight wobble that I was always meaning to fix. The cheerful, crayon-colored magnets holding Lily's artwork on the refrigerator door seemed to mock us. My laptop was open between us, a portal to a world of rejection. Credit score too low, insufficient collateral, unable to approve at this time. Each denial was a small, sharp stab. We called every number we could think of. Emergency loan companies with predatory interest rates, credit unions, even online lenders who promised miracles. The answer was always the same. No. Sometime around 3 a.m. David pushed his chair back from the table with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He disappeared into the garage. When he came back, he was holding a set of keys. Not the keys to his practical sedan he used for work, but the keys to the '69 Ford Mustang he'd spent the last 5 years restoring. It was his baby, a gleaming machine of midnight blue and chrome that he'd rebuilt from the ground up with his own 2 hands. It had belonged to his father. "I'll call Johnson in the morning," he said quietly. placing the keys on the table between us. He's always wanted it. He'll give me cash. David, no, I breathed. You love that car. He took my hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on my palm. I love Lily more. His sacrifice, so freely given, was a stark, painful contrast to the cold calculation of my own parents. They had weighed their granddaughter's life against a party and found it wanting. David was willing to sell a piece of his soul without a moment's hesitation. We spent the rest of the night tallying up our meager resources. The money from the Mustang, the entirety of our life savings, a laughable sum, an early, penalized withdrawal from David's 401k. By the time the gray, watery light of dawn began to seep through the kitchen window, we had a number. $72,000. I stared at the figure I'd scrawled on a notepad. It was everything we had in the world, every penny we'd ever saved, every dream we'd ever deferred. And it wasn't enough. We were still $23,000 short. I dropped my head into my hands, the exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical illness. The final rejection from an online lender, a cold, automated email, still burned on my laptop screen. It was over. We had failed. Thank you for being here with me from the very first moments of this story. If you're listening, please let me know what city you're tuning in from in the comments below. It helps to know I'm not alone. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something vaguely like burnt coffee. It's a smell that sears itself into your memory when your world is falling apart. I sat in a hard plastic chair by Lily's bedside, a position I hadn't left for what felt like days. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor was the only music in our small, sterile world. Beep, beep, beep. A fragile metronome counting down the seconds we had left. Lily was asleep, her small face pale against the stark white of the pillowcase. Her favorite stuffed bunny, worn thin from years of cuddles, was tucked under her arm. An IV line snaked from a bag of clear fluid into her tiny, bruised hand. She looked so small, so impossibly fragile, like a little bird with a broken wing. I watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Each breath was a gift, a miracle, and each breath was a reminder that the clock was ticking. 48 hours, the doctor had said. We were already halfway through that. Sometime in the sterile quiet of that room, something inside me shifted. The frantic, screaming panic that had been my constant companion for the last 24 hours began to recede. The hot tears of grief and rage dried up. They didn't disappear. They crystallized. They hardened into something cold, clear, and sharp. I stopped crying. I stopped pleading with a universe that wasn't listening. I looked at my daughter, this perfect, beautiful little person who depended on me for everything, and a new kind of resolve settled over me. I was done being a victim. I was done begging for scraps of compassion from people who had none to give. The time for sorrow was over. It was time to fight. I pulled out my phone, its battery blinking a low-power warning. I opened a new note. At the top, I typed 2 words, Project Lily. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It was an instinct. I'm a designer. I solve problems. I create order out of chaos. And this was the ultimate design problem, how to build a future for my daughter out of the wreckage of our present. My mind, which had been a fog of fear, suddenly became sharp. I thought back to the conversation in my father's study. I replayed every word, every nuance, every cold, dismissive glance, and I started to type. Eleanor Palmer, we simply can't, Amanda. Ethan's wedding is in 3 months. Richard Palmer, $250,000, non-refundable deposits. Ethan Palmer, Always trying to steal my spotlight. Get better insurance next time." I recorded their words with the dispassionate precision of a court stenographer. I was no longer their daughter, begging for their love. I was a researcher, gathering data. Then, a memory surfaced, unbidden but startlingly clear. It was from years ago, when I was maybe 10 years old. I was at my grandmother Rose's house, sitting at her kitchen table. She was my mother's mother, a woman who smelled of cinnamon and lavender, a woman whose hands were always busy, either knitting or baking or tending her garden. She was teaching me how to balance a checkbook, a skill she insisted was more important than algebra. I remembered her voice, warm but firm, as she tapped a long, elegant finger on the ledger. "Never let anyone underestimate your worth, Amanda," she had said, her sharp blue eyes looking directly into mine. "And always, always keep the receipts. They are your proof. They are your power." At the time, I thought she just meant for taxes. But sitting there in that silent, beeping hospital room, her words took on a new, profound meaning. Keep the receipts. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. The grief was still there, a hard, cold stone in my chest. But now it had a purpose. It was no longer just pain. It was fuel. I looked at Lily, so peaceful in her sleep, and I made her a silent promise. I would save her, and I would remember everything. I would keep all the receipts. The doorbell rang at 6:13 a.m. The sound was so jarring in the oppressive silence of our apartment that I flinched. David and I had come home from the hospital for a few hours to try and get some sleep, a futile effort. I stumbled to the door, still wearing yesterday's clothes, my hair a tangled mess. When I opened it, my in-laws, George and Carol, were standing on our porch. George, his face weathered and kind beneath a faded baseball cap, held a large thermos. Carol, a small, bustling woman who was the embodiment of warmth, clutched her worn leather purse like a lifeline. "Amanda," George said, his voice gruff with concern, "we came as soon as we heard. David's phone must have died." I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. They stepped inside, their presence immediately filling our small, sad apartment with a sense of gentle strength. They didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. They just sat on our lumpy sofa, their eyes full of a deep, unwavering compassion that I was so desperate for. David came out of the bedroom, his face hollow with exhaustion. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" "We heard what happened," Carol said, her voice soft. "How is our grandbaby?" "Stable," I managed to say, the medical term tasting bitter on my tongue. "For now." George cleared his throat, shifting his worn work boots on our scuffed floor. We sold the retirement plot." I blanked, confused. The retirement plot was their dream. 5 acres of pine-covered land in Montana, right next to a trout stream. George had spent the better part of 20 years planning the small cabin he was going to build there with his own hands. It was where they were going to spend their golden years, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. "What?" David asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "Dad, that land was your everything." George looked at his son, his eyes, the same deep brown as David's, steady and clear. "No," he said simply, "family is everything." Carol reached into her purse, her hands trembling slightly. She pulled out a cashier's check and placed it on our coffee table. I stared at the slip of paper, my eyes focused on the number written in neat, official print. $38,000. The room blurred as tears I thought I no longer had filled my eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. David knelt beside his mother, his voice choked with emotion. "We can't take this."
"You can and you will," Carol said firmly, placing her hand on his cheek. Her touch was so full of love, it was almost painful to watch. This is what family does. We show up. And they did. They showed up in every way imaginable. A few hours later, after the wire transfer had gone through and the hospital administrator had nodded with grim satisfaction, the surgery was scheduled. Lily was wheeled away into the operating room, her small hand clutching her stuffed bunny. The wait was an agony unlike any I have ever known. But I wasn't alone. David was there, his hand a constant, steady pressure in mine. And across from us, in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, sat George and Carol. They had brought the thermos of homemade chicken soup and a quiet determination that was more comforting than any words could ever be. They just sat with us for hour after agonizing hour, a silent, unwavering wall of support. 14 hours, that's how long the surgery took. 14 hours of staring at a clock, of drinking burnt coffee, of praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. When the surgeon, Dr. Levine, finally emerged, his surgical cap still on, his face etched with fatigue, my heart stopped. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. He looked at us, and his tired eyes crinkled at the corners. A small, exhausted smile touched his lips. "She's going to make it." The words washed over me, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I fell into David's arms, sobbing. Across the room, I saw George put his arm around Carol, his own eyes suspiciously bright. In that moment, in that sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, the truth settled into my soul with the force of a revelation. My parents, with their marble foyer and their non-refundable deposits, were not my family. These people, George and Carol, with their sold-off dream and their thermos of soup, they were. Family wasn't about blood. It was about who shows up when the world is burning down around you. And in my darkest hour, they had shown up with buckets of water. I opened the file on my phone, Project Lily. I took a photo of the check from George and Carol. Underneath, I typed, Receipt B, a sold dream, a saved life. Lily's recovery was slow and arduous, a journey measured in milliliters of medication and tiny incremental gains. But with each passing day, a little more color returned to her cheeks. Her laughter, when it finally came back, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Our little apartment, which had been shrouded in a fog of fear, slowly began to fill with light again. While we were living in this bubble of tentative hope, my biological family continued their campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. They weren't content with their initial abandonment. They seemed determined to rub salt in the wound they had created. The first needle arrived via text message, a week after Lily's successful surgery. It was from Ethan. Mom wants to know if Lily survived. Also, you really caused a scene at my engagement dinner. Super embarrassing. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. If she survived. Not, how is she? Not, we're so relieved. Just a casual clinical inquiry, tacked on to a complaint about my lack of social graces. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot, saved it to my Project Lily file, and labeled it, Receipt C, Sibling Concern. Another text arrived a few minutes later, this one a forward from my father. It was a message he had clearly intended for someone else, probably one of his country club friends. Told the Hamiltons you were too irresponsible to afford proper insurance. We have to manage the narrative here. This family's reputation is paramount. He was doing damage control. Not for my daughter's health, but for his social standing. I saved that one too. Receipt D, Reputation Management. Then came the voicemail from my father, Richard. His voice was cold, clipped, the same tone he used on underperforming employees. Amanda, your actions reflect poorly on this family.
Your financial irresponsibility is not our problem. Your brother manages his money properly. Perhaps you should take notes instead of asking for handouts." I listened to it once, my hand trembling. Then I saved the audio file. Receipt A. Parental negligence. I had mislabeled it before. This was more accurate. The final, most exquisite piece of cruelty arrived in the mail a few days later. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. Blake and Chloe's wedding invitation. It was addressed only to Miss Amanda Sterling. There was no mention of David, my husband of 10 years. There was no mention of Lily, his sick granddaughter. It was as if they didn't exist. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. I held the invitation in my hands, the heavy cardstock feeling like a tombstone. They weren't just ignoring our pain. They were actively trying to edit us out of the family portrait. They wanted me to show up, alone, and smile and pretend that everything was fine. They wanted me to validate their perfect, curated world while mine was still in pieces. Something inside me, something that had been holding on by a thread, finally snapped. The pain was still there, a dull, constant ache, but it was no longer a debilitating grief. It was a cold, hard, clarifying anger. I didn't throw the invitation away. I placed it neatly inside the file folder on my computer next to the screenshots and the audio file. Receipt E, the erasure. These weren't just receipts anymore. They were evidence. They were building blocks. I didn't know what I was building yet, but I knew it would be strong. It would be fortified, and it would be a structure that my parents would never, ever be able to enter again. The foundation was being laid, not with concrete and steel, but with their own casual, calculated cruelty. The months after Lily's recovery were a blur of checkups, mounting medical bills, and a gnawing financial anxiety that kept me awake at night. The relief of her survival was quickly replaced by the crushing weight of our debt. We were drowning. My small interior design business, which had been my passion project, was now our only lifeline. I poured every ounce of my energy into it, working late into the night at our wobbly kitchen table, sketches and fabric samples spread out around me. The exhaustion was bone deep, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, desperate determination. I would never be that vulnerable again. I would never again be in a position where I had to beg for my child's life. Then, an opportunity arose. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary pass. Westbrook Hotels, a boutique chain, was looking for a firm to handle a complete redesign of all 7 of their locations. The budget was $1.8 million. It was a career-making contract, the kind of project that could change everything. The competition was fierce. 3 established, prestigious firms with impressive portfolios and sleek downtown offices. And then there was me, Amanda Sterling Designs, operating out of a 2-bedroom apartment with a portfolio of mostly residential projects and a mountain of medical debt. My biggest rival was Marcus Thorne, a designer known for his minimalist, almost clinical style and his cutthroat business tactics. He was everything I wasn't, well-connected, arrogant, and backed by a team of 20. He made it clear he considered me a non-entity. I spent weeks preparing my pitch, barely sleeping, fueled by caffeine and sheer willpower. David was my rock, taking over all the household duties, keeping Lily entertained, and whispering words of encouragement when he found me passed out on my drafting table at 2 a.m. George and Carol brought over home-cooked meals, their quiet support a constant source of strength. The day of the final presentation, I stood before a boardroom of 5 executives in tailored suits. The room was intimidating, with a wall of windows overlooking the city, a view that seemed to mock my small-scale existence. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged my material samples on the gleaming mahogany table.
Marcus Thorne had presented right before me. His pitch was slick, full of corporate jargon and computer-generated renderings that were technically perfect but utterly soulless. The CEO, a stern-faced man named Mr. Harrison, looked at my proposal, his brow furrowed. "Miss Sterling," he began, his voice laced with skepticism, "your firm is considerably smaller than the others we're considering. In fact, I'm not seeing evidence of a firm at all, just you." The room chilled by 10 degrees. This was it, the moment of truth. I took a deep breath and met his gaze. "Currently, yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "but that's about to change." I didn't talk about thread counts or profit margins. I talked about what a hotel room means to the people who stay there. I talked about it being a shelter during life's biggest moments. Honeymoons, reunions, triumphs, and sometimes even grief. "The difference between a forgettable stay and a memorable one," I said, unveiling my concept boards, "isn't the size of the lobby. It's whether a space feels like it was created for humans or for photographs." I showed them my designs. Rooms with secret reading nooks, family suites with thoughtful touches for kids, business rooms with lighting designed to combat jet lag. The financial officer was checking his watch. I was losing them. It was time for my final play. I pulled out a photograph. It was of a small, rustic cabin, the one George and Carol had planned to build. "Last year," I began, my voice quiet but clear, "my in-laws sold their dream to help pay for my daughter's heart surgery after my own parents refused to help." The room stilled. Even the financial officer looked up. "When my daughter recovered, I redesigned their new, much smaller place as a thank you. I didn't just replace what they lost. I built what they deserved, a space that honors who they are." I showed them the after photos, the custom fishing rod storage, the kitchen island sized for Carol's pie making, the window seat perfectly angled for George's birdwatching. "That," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction born of pain and love, "is what I do. I create spaces that remember the humans who inhabit them." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "Why do you deserve this contract, Miss Sterling?" I thought of Lily in her hospital bed, of David selling his Mustang, of George and Carol giving up their future for ours. "Because I've learned what matters," I answered simply. And it's not what most people think. 3 days later, an email arrived. "Westbrook Hotels is pleased to inform you that we have accepted your proposal." I had won. I had actually won. 6 months after landing the Westbrook contract, my life was unrecognizable. Amanda Sterling Designs was no longer just a name on a business card. It was a real studio with frosted glass doors, a team of 3 talented designers, and a growing list of clients. The wobbly kitchen table had been replaced by a sleek, custom-built workspace. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. I worked with a singular focus, driven by the memory of that rainy night. I established a company policy from day one: full health coverage for all employees and their families, no waiting period. My accountant told me it was cutting into my profits. I told him some costs were investments, not expenses. My parents and Ethan occasionally sent feeler texts, casual messages that pretended nothing had happened. "Heard you're doing well. We should have lunch." I ignored them all. Deleting their messages without responding became a small, satisfying ritual. The door to my old life was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. Then, one evening, an email appeared in my inbox with a subject line that made my heart skip a beat. A message regarding the Palmers. The sender's address was encrypted, anonymous. My first instinct was to delete it, assuming it was spam or some new form of harassment for my family. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. The message was brief and to the point. "Miss Sterling, I admire what you've built. You may not know me, but I know your family. They are not what they seem. Their financial situation is a house of cards. Be careful, and know that you have an ally you don't expect. There was no signature. I read it 3 times, a chill running down my spine. Who could have sent this? An angry ex-employee of my father's? A spurned business associate? A week later, another email arrived from the same anonymous address. This one contained a single attachment, a scanned copy of a catering invoice for Ethan and Chloe's wedding. The total was astronomical, far beyond what even a successful furniture store could comfortably afford. A small handwritten note was scrawled at the bottom of the invoice, paid for with a second mortgage on the company warehouse. RP doesn't know. RP, Richard Palmer. My father. He didn't know. My mind started racing. Who would have access to this? Who would know about a secret mortgage? And who would care enough to send it to me? It was David who figured it out. He was looking over my shoulder at the invoice, at the ridiculously expensive menu items, the oyster bar, the champagne fountain. Who's the one person who would be involved in every detail of the wedding planning, but also be an outsider? He asked quietly. And then it hit me. Chloe, Ethan's beautiful, intelligent fiancée. The woman who had stood silently behind him in the doorway of my father's study, her expression unreadable. I remembered her at the engagement party. While Ethan was preening and my parents were posturing, I remembered catching her eye for a brief moment. I had seen something there. Not pity, but a flicker of assessment, of sharp, calculating intelligence. She was playing a long game. She had been drawn in by the illusion of the wealthy, powerful Palmer family, but she was smart enough to see the cracks in the facade. She was gathering her own receipts. That night, I replied to the anonymous email for the first time. My message was just 3 words. Thank you. Why? The response came back almost immediately. Because I detest bullies. And I believe in women who build their own empires instead of marrying into crumbling ones. Keep fighting. You're not alone. A slow smile spread across my face. This changed things. The game wasn't just me against them anymore. There was a new player on the board, an ally working from within the enemy camp. The house of cards my family had built was about to face a storm, and now a gust of wind was coming from the inside. I saved the email and the invoice. Receipt F, the internal ally. The file was getting thicker. 3 years passed. 3 years of relentless work, of healing, of building. Amanda Sterling Designs was no longer a scrappy startup. It was a nationally recognized firm with offices in Seattle and a waiting list of clients. Lily was a happy, healthy 8-year-old who had no memory of the beeping machines and sterile white rooms, only a faint, pale scar on her chest that she called her bravery line. We had a new home, one with a backyard big enough for a swing set, and George and Carol were over so often they had their own set of keys. Life was good. It was stable. It was everything I had fought for. The call came from Entrepreneur magazine. They wanted to feature me on their cover for their Women in Leadership issue. It was a staggering honor, the kind of validation I had never even allowed myself to dream of. The interview was conducted by a sharp, insightful journalist named Sarah. We talked for hours about design philosophy, business strategy, and my commitment to providing comprehensive health care for my employees. Towards the end, she leaned forward, her expression softening. "Amanda," she said gently, "I've read about your company's charitable arm, the foundation you started. What was the catalyst for that? It seems very personal." I took a deep breath. For 3 years, I had kept the story locked away, a private pain that fueled my public success. I had never spoken about it to anyone outside my inner circle. But looking at Sarah, at her intelligent, compassionate eyes, I felt that it was time. Time to own my entire story, not just the triumphant final chapter. So, I told her. I told her everything. About the rainy night, the marble foyer, the non-refundable deposits. I told her about David's Mustang and George and Carol's sole dream. I didn't use vague terms or gentle euphemisms. I used their names. I quoted their words. I laid the unvarnished, ugly truth out on the table. When I finished, there were tears in Sarah's eyes. "That's not just a business story," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's a survival story." A month later, the magazine hit the newsstands. My face was on the cover, my expression calm and confident. But it was the pull quote they had highlighted in bold that took my breath away. "My own parents let my daughter die for a party." That's when I learned that blood doesn't define family. Love does. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The article went viral. My story, our story, was shared tens of thousands of times on social media. It was picked up by news outlets, blogs, and television shows. I was inundated with messages from strangers, women who had their own stories of family betrayal, who thanked me for my courage in speaking out. It was like a dam had broken. The truth, which I had held back for so long, was now a raging river, and it was heading straight for the Palmer family's carefully constructed mansion. I didn't do it for revenge, not really. I did it because it was the truth. It was the foundation upon which my entire new life had been built, and I was tired of hiding it. The first sign of the floodwaters reaching them came from an unexpected source. Elaine Withers, a woman who sat on the same charity board as my mother, called me directly. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "but the Palmers are becoming social pariahs. People are canceling their accounts at their store. At the spring gala, no one would sit at their table. The article, everyone has read it." I thanked her for the call, my voice neutral. But after I hung up, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I might have expected. I just felt a hollow sort of finality, like turning the last page of a long, difficult book. The story was no longer just mine. It belonged to the world now, and the world was passing its judgment. The river of truth unleashed by the magazine article quickly became a destructive flood. The carefully curated world of the Palmer family began to crumble, brick by gilded brick. Chloe, my internal ally, kept me updated through her anonymous emails. Her messages were no longer just snippets of information. They were detailed reports from the front lines of a collapsing dynasty. Ethan, she told me, had been called into his boss's office the day after the article was published. The promotion he had been bragging about for months was suddenly off the table. His character had been called into question. He had apparently thrown a tantrum, blaming me for sabotaging his career. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Then came the news about the business. Palmer Furnishings, a store that had been a local institution for 40 years, was hemorrhaging money. 3 of their largest corporate accounts, held by companies whose CEOs were all family men, canceled their contracts within a week. The reason given was brand misalignment. No one wanted to be associated with the family who chose a wedding over a child's life. The social shunning was even more brutal. My mother, Eleanor, who lived for her charity luncheons and her status as a community pillar, was effectively excommunicated. Invitations stopped arriving. Her calls went unreturned. Chloe described finding her weeping in the garden, not out of remorse for what she had done, but out of fury at what she had lost. But it was my father, Richard, who seemed to be the most affected, in his own cold, silent way. He had built his identity on the foundation of being a successful, respected businessman. Now that foundation was cracking beneath his feet. He became withdrawn, spending his days locked in his study, the same study where he had passed judgment on me 3 years earlier. The most surprising development, however, came from my Aunt Brenda, my father's sister. She called me, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, Amanda, you poor thing," she cooed. "I can't believe what Richard and Eleanor did. I always knew they were cold. I've been telling your father for years that he's too soft on Ethan." It was a masterful performance. She was positioning herself as my ally, the one good member of the family. But I knew better. I remembered her subtle manipulations over the years, the way she would praise Ethan in front of my parents while subtly undermining my own achievements. Chloe had confirmed my suspicions in an email. "Brenda is here every day. She brings casseroles and whispers poison in your mother's ear about you. Then goes to your father and whispers poison about your mother and Ethan. She's a vulture, circling what she thinks will be a carcass." She was trying to play both sides, hoping to pick up the pieces when it all fell apart. I played along, thanking her for her support, my voice sweet as honey. I saved the recording of our call. Receipt G, the Vulture's Song. The final blow came, as it so often does, in the form of a legal document. The bank, spooked by the company's declining revenue and the public scandal, called in their loans. The second mortgage that Ethan had secretly taken out on the warehouse was the nail in the coffin. They were over-leveraged and had no way to recover. Palmer Furnishings, the legacy my grandfather had built and my father had inherited, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A few weeks later, a for sale sign was hammered into the lush green lawn of the Tudor-style mansion I had grown up in. The life they had chosen over my daughters was officially being foreclosed on. Just when I thought the saga couldn't get any more dramatic, Chloe sent me what she called the grand finale. It was a thick manila envelope left for me by a courier at my office reception. There was no note, just a USB drive tucked inside. I plugged it into my laptop, my heart pounding. The drive contained a meticulously organized set of files, scanned bank statements, loan applications, and email chains. Chloe, with her sharp mind and her access as Ethan's fiancée, had been quietly compiling a dossier of his financial malfeasance for over a year. And there it was, in black and white, the smoking gun. Ethan hadn't just taken out a second mortgage on the company warehouse. He had systematically been draining funds from the business for years. There were charges for lavish vacations he and Chloe had taken, for a sports car he had purchased, for designer clothes and expensive dinners. He had been treating the family business like his personal ATM. But the most damning evidence was the loan application for the warehouse mortgage. He had needed my father's signature, so he had forged it. The application was riddled with inconsistencies, but the signature was a decent imitation. It was just good enough to pass a cursory glance from a loan officer eager to close a deal. This wasn't just irresponsibility anymore. This was fraud. This was a federal crime. The email chains were even more revealing. They showed Ethan pressuring the wedding vendors for increasingly extravagant additions, always promising that Dad is covering it. He had lied to everyone, to my parents, to Chloe, to the bank. He had built his entire champagne and oyster lifestyle on a mountain of debt and deceit, using the family company as his collateral. The $250,000 wedding wasn't just an expense my parents had chosen to prioritize. It was the final, reckless act that had pushed their already struggling business over the edge. I sat there, staring at the screen, a cold fury rising within me. For years, they had called me the irresponsible one. My father had lectured me on financial management. My mother had whispered about my poor decisions. And all the while, their golden boy, their precious son, was a common thief, robbing them blind. I forwarded the entire contents of the USB drive to my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Albright. Her response came within the hour. "Amanda, this is more than enough. This is ironclad." What do you want to do with it? What did I want to do? A year ago, I might have wanted to see Ethan in handcuffs. I might have wanted to see him publicly humiliated, his perfect life dismantled piece by piece. But looking at the evidence, I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, the drama, the toxicity. This evidence wasn't a weapon for revenge. It was a shield. It was the final, unbreakable piece of armor I would need for the inevitable final confrontation. Because I knew they were coming. Stripped of their business, their home, and their social standing, they had only one place left to turn. They were coming for me. And this time, I would be ready. I wouldn't be the trembling, rain-soaked girl on their marble floor. I would be the woman who held all the receipts. The summons came, as I knew it would, in the form of an email from a lawyer I'd never heard of. The subject line read, "Urgent family matter, request for mediation." My own lawyer, Miss Albright, had warned me this was their likely next move. "They'll try to frame it as a family dispute," she'd said, her voice dry. "They'll appeal to your sense of duty, of guilt. They will try to make you feel responsible for their downfall." The email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. It spoke of unfortunate public misunderstandings and the deep pain my parents were experiencing. It suggested a meeting at the lawyer's office to begin the process of healing and to discuss Amanda's familial obligations in this difficult time.
Familial obligations. The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. Their audacity was breathtaking. After choosing a party over my daughter's life, after years of neglect and criticism, after being exposed for their own incompetence and their son's criminality, they still believed I owed them something. "They're not seeking healing," Miss Albright said when I forwarded her the email. "They're seeking a bailout, and they're trying to create a legal setting where they can pressure you into giving it to them." I felt a tremor of the old fear, the ingrained instinct of a daughter who had always sought her parents' approval, but it was quickly replaced by the cold, hard resolve I had forged in that hospital waiting room. "I'll go," I told her.
"Are you sure?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. "You have no legal obligation to do so." "I'm sure," I said, "but we're not going to mediate. We're going to end this, once and for all." For the next week, Miss Albright and I prepared. We didn't prepare a defense. We prepared an offense. We compiled every piece of evidence from my Project Lily file into a neat, damning portfolio. The screenshots, the audio files, the wedding invitation, the financial records from Chloe, the evidence of Ethan's fraud. Each exhibit was cataloged and cross-referenced. It was no longer a collection of personal hurts. It was a legal case. The day of the meeting, I chose my outfit with care. Not a power suit, but a simple, elegant black dress. I wanted to look calm, composed, untouchable. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a character in a movie prepare for her final scene. As I was about to leave my office, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. She had finalized her divorce from Ethan the day before. Her message was simple. "He told me his parents are meeting you today. They think you're their last hope. Don't let them manipulate you. Remember who you are. Good luck." I smiled. I knew exactly who I was. I was the woman who had survived their storm and built her own fortress. And today, I wasn't just going to defend my walls. I was going to show them that they had given me the very stones I had used to build them. The meeting wasn't a mediation. It was a reckoning, and I was the one holding the ledger. The law office was exactly as I'd imagined. Mahogany, leather, and the hushed, expensive silence of money. A receptionist with a polite, plastic smile led me and Miss Albright to a conference room. The air was thick with tension.
My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were already seated at the long, polished table. They looked smaller, diminished. My father's expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and his face was gray with stress. My mother's makeup was a little too thick, a desperate attempt to cover the dark circles under her eyes. Her pearls seemed to mock her, a relic from a life she no longer lived. Their lawyer, a portly man with a self-important air, sat beside them. They looked up as I entered. I saw a flicker of hope in my mother's eyes, the hope of a gambler placing her last chip on a long shot. My father's expression was harder to read, a mixture of resentment and desperation. I took the seat directly across from them, placing my simple leather portfolio on the table. Miss Albright sat beside me, radiating a calm, formidable competence. Their lawyer, Mr. Davison, cleared his throat and began. He launched into a saccharine speech about the sanctity of family, the importance of forgiveness, and the pain his clients had endured. He painted them as victims of a changing economy, of a misunderstanding, of a daughter's public betrayal. "Your parents love you very much, Amanda," he concluded, his tone oozing with false sincerity. "They are here today with open hearts, hoping to mend this terrible rift." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before I spoke. My voice, when it came, was quiet, calm, and devoid of emotion. My daughter almost died. The 4 simple words cut through the lawyer's rehearsed speech like a surgeon's scalpel. My mother flinched. "Now, Amanda, that's not fair," she began, her voice trembling. "We didn't understand the severity." "You understood that the cost was $95,000, I interrupted, my gaze fixed on her. "And you understood that the deposit on your son's wedding was $250,000. Those numbers seem quite severe, and you understood them perfectly." Richard straightened in his chair, adopting his old boardroom bluster. "This is about more than just money. This is about family loyalty. You dragged our name through the mud with that magazine article. You destroyed us." "No," I said, my voice still level. "You destroyed yourselves. I just held up a mirror." Mr. Davison tried to intervene. "Miss Sterling, we are here to find a constructive path forward. Your parents are facing foreclosure. They have lost everything. Surely you feel some sense of familial duty." That was the moment, the final, arrogant overreach. Miss Albright gave me a subtle nod. I leaned forward slightly. "Let's talk about duty," I said. "Let's review the events of the last 3 years, shall we? So there are no more misunderstandings." Eleanor started to cry then, soft, theatrical sobs. "After all we've done for you," she wept. "We gave you everything. How can you be so cruel?" I looked at my mother, at this woman who was a stranger to me, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a vast, empty distance. The girl who had begged for her love was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had brought receipts, and it was time to present them. Miss Albright opened her portfolio. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a tense family drama to a formal legal proceeding. "Mr. Davison," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "since your clients seem to have a selective memory of events, perhaps a brief review is in order." She placed the first item on the polished table, sliding it across to face my parents. It was a high-quality printout of the screenshot of Ethan's text message. "Exhibit A," Miss Albright announced. "A text from your son, Ethan Palmer, sent 1 week after his niece's major heart surgery. Mom wants to know if Lily survived. No question mark, no expression of relief. A clinical inquiry into the status of a potential family inconvenience."
My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went rigid. Next, Miss Albright slid a small audio player onto the table. Exhibit B, a voicemail left by your client, Mr. Richard Palmer, on my client's phone. She pressed play. My father's cold, angry voice filled the silent room. Amanda, your actions reflect poorly on this family. Your financial irresponsibility is not our problem. Perhaps you should take notes instead of asking for handouts.
The sound of his own voice, so full of contempt, seemed to suck the air out of him. He visibly deflated in his chair. Exhibit C, Ms. Albright continued, her rhythm steady and relentless. She placed the cream-colored wedding invitation in the center of the table. An invitation to the wedding your clients prioritized over their granddaughter's life. An invitation addressed only to Ms. Amanda Sterling, effectively erasing her husband and child from the family. Their lawyer, Mr. Davison, was starting to sweat. He shuffled his papers, looking for an objection he knew he couldn't make. This wasn't a courtroom, but Miss Albright was treating it like one. And now, she said, her voice dropping slightly, we come to the matter of the business. The business you, Mr. Palmer, claim my client destroyed. She placed a new folder on the table. It was thicker than the others. My client recently came into possession of some interesting financial documents pertaining to Palmer Furnishings. She laid them out one by one. The bank statements showing years of unauthorized withdrawals by Ethan. The loan application for the warehouse with my father's forged signatures circled in red. The email chains where Ethan promised vendors payment from a company he was actively bankrupting. It seems, Mr. Palmer, Ms. Albright said, looking directly at my father, that the person who destroyed your company wasn't my client. It was your son. This isn't a case of brand mismanagement, it's a case of felony fraud. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at the forged signature, his face ashen. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. All the fight went out of him. Eleanor just stared at me, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. The narrative she had so carefully constructed of the long-suffering parents and the ungrateful daughter had just been systematically dismantled, piece by damning piece. Mr. Davison finally found his voice, though it was weak and reedy. This is a family matter." "No," Miss Albright said, her voice like steel. "This is a matter of record, and the record is quite clear." She leaned back in her chair, her work done. She had laid the foundation. Now it was my turn to place the capstone. My parents sat in stunned silence, the evidence of their failure and their son's betrayal laid out before them on the polished mahogany. They had come here expecting to appeal to my guilt, to manipulate me with talk of family, but they had walked into a deposition. Richard finally looked up at me, his eyes pleading for the first time in his life. "Amanda, I didn't know about the fraud, I swear it." "It doesn't matter what you knew," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "It only matters what you did and what you didn't do." Eleanor, her face streaked with mascara, reached a trembling hand across the table. "Please, sweetie, we're your parents. We have nowhere else to go. The bank is taking the house. We have nothing." This was it, the final desperate plea. And for a fleeting second, a ghost of the old Amanda surfaced, the girl who would have done anything to hear a word of love from her mother. But she was gone. I looked at Miss Albright. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through my mother's sobs, "that's not entirely true. You do have something.
Or rather, you had something. She reached into her portfolio one last time and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. She placed it on the table. It was old, the paper yellowed with age. "This," Miss Albright announced, "is a certified copy of the last will and testament of Mrs. Rose DeWitt, your mother, Eleanor." A flicker of confusion crossed my mother's face. "My mother's will? What does that have to do with anything? She left everything to me and Richard. The business, the house, it was all part of the inheritance." "Not exactly," Miss Albright corrected her gently. "She left you and your husband conditional control. Your mother was a very shrewd woman, it seems. She had concerns." Miss Albright broke the seal and unfolded the document. "I'll read the relevant clause. It's titled, 'The Matriarch's Provision.' Your mother stipulated that while you and your husband would have operational control of the company and residence in the Associated Family Trust, that control was contingent on two things." She paused for dramatic effect. The entire room was holding its breath. "First, that the company, Palmer Furnishings, remain solvent and debt-free. And second," she looked directly at my mother, "that you, as her daughter, never commit an act of gross moral negligence toward her grandchildren, which she specifically defines as placing material or social concerns above their well-being." Eleanor's face went white as a sheet. "The will further stipulates," Miss Albright continued, her voice ringing with finality, "that should either of these conditions be breached, a process I believe was triggered by your son's fraud and your actions 3 years ago, then full and irrevocable control of the entire trust, the business assets, all remaining properties, and the brand trademark is to be immediately transferred to her eldest grandchild." She folded the document neatly and looked at me. "Congratulations, Amanda. As of the bankruptcy filing, you are the legal owner of your family's entire legacy." The silence was broken by a strangled gasp from my mother. My father simply stared into space, his mind clearly unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. He had not only lost his company to his son's greed, but he had lost it years ago to his own moral failure. My grandmother, from beyond the grave, had delivered the final, crushing blow. She had kept the ultimate receipt. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. You are an incredible and patient audience. If you could, please like this video and comment with the number 1 below, just so I know you've journeyed this far with me. Your support means more than you can possibly imagine. Just comment with the number 1, and then listen as I tell you how this all ended. The aftermath of that meeting was not explosive. It was quiet. A quiet, final, and total surrender. There were no more arguments, no more pleas. My parents and their lawyer simply packed up their briefcases and left, their shoulders slumped with the weight of a defeat so complete it was absolute. I never saw or spoke to them again. I heard through the grapevine that my Aunt Brenda, the vulture, had refused to take them in. They ended up moving to a small, rented apartment in a town I'd never heard of, their opulent life a distant memory. Ethan, facing federal fraud charges, took a plea deal. He served 18 months in a low-security prison. I was now the owner of a bankrupt company, and a legacy I wasn't sure I wanted. But my grandmother's final act of faith in me was a gift I couldn't squander. I didn't try to revive Palmer Furnishings. The brand was tainted, the assets liquidated. Instead, with Miss Albright's help, I did something else. I systematically dismantled the old empire and used its bones to build something new. I sold the warehouse and the remaining company properties. The Tudor-style mansion, now legally mine, went on the market. With the proceeds, the first thing I did was pay back every small vendor and craftsman that my father and Ethan had left in the lurch. I made sure Frank Miller, the long-suffering accountant, got his full pension.
The rest of the money, a considerable sum, became the seed capital for a new venture. It wasn't a business. It was a foundation. I called it the Lily Heart Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide funding for life-saving heart surgeries for children whose families were uninsured or underinsured. My first act as president of the foundation was to write a check to George and Carol, reimbursing them for the Montana land they had sold, with significant interest. They tried to refuse, but I wouldn't let them. It wasn't a payment. It was a restoration of a dream they had so selflessly sacrificed. Chloe, now divorced and free, went back to school and became a therapist specializing in helping people leave toxic family systems. She became one of my closest friends and a board member of the foundation. We had been forged in the same fire, and our bond was unbreakable. My own company, Amanda Sterling Designs, continued to flourish, but its success was no longer about financial security. It was about creating a different kind of legacy, one of integrity, compassion, and strength. We took on pro bono projects, designing warm and welcoming spaces for women's shelters and pediatric hospital wings. I was no longer just building spaces. I was building hope. I had taken the ugliest chapter of my life and turned it into a force for good. The pain was still a part of my story, a scar on my memory like the one on Lily's chest, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a reminder of my own strength, of my capacity to survive and to build something beautiful from the rubble. My grandmother hadn't just left me an inheritance of assets. She had left me an inheritance of purpose. It's been 5 years since that day in the conference room. I'm sitting on the back porch of my home, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand. The late afternoon sun spills across the yard, casting long, peaceful shadows. It's a golden, buttery light, the kind that makes everything look soft and beautiful. From here, I can hear the sound of a piano. It's Lily, now a vibrant, healthy 13-year-old, practicing a piece for her recital. Her fingers, once so small and tethered to IV lines, now dance across the keys with a confidence that takes my breath away. The piano was a gift from her grandpa George. In the garden, David is teaching our 7-year-old son Sam how to properly stake a tomato plant. George is beside them, offering his expert advice, his laughter carrying on the warm evening air. Carol is in the kitchen, humming to herself as she bakes one of her legendary apple pies, the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifting out to greet me. This is my family. This is my world. It's not loud or flashy. It's not built on marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It's built on shared laughter, on home-cooked meals, on quiet moments of unconditional love. It's built on showing up. A few months ago, a letter arrived with no return address. It was from my mother. It was a rambling, self-pitying account of her hardships, ending with a half-hearted apology that was more of an accusation. I read it, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something like pity for her. She had spent her whole life chasing a version of happiness that was as empty and fragile as a glass ornament. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Her story and mine had diverged so completely, we were no longer even in the same book. Sometimes Lily asks about them, her other grandparents. I tell her the truth, in a way a child can understand. I tell her that some people's hearts are built in a way that doesn't have enough room for the things that truly matter. She looks at George, laughing with her brother in the garden, and she seems to understand. "That's okay, Mom," she told me once, her wisdom far beyond her years. "Our house is full enough." She's right. My life is full. It's full of the love of a good man, the joy of my children, and the steadfast devotion of the family that chose us. I once thought that the greatest victory would be watching my parents realize what they had lost. But the true victory, the real revenge, wasn't in their downfall. It was in this, right here, in this quiet, ordinary, beautiful moment. It was in building a happiness so complete, so profound, that they couldn't even comprehend it, let alone touch it. It was the simple, unshakable peace of having everything that truly matters. Thank you so much for listening to my entire story. I am truly grateful for your time and your presence. If you would, please comment with the letter A below, so I know you are one of the special few who stayed until the very end. If you have any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share, please write them down. And please, continue to click on the other videos on this channel to enjoy more of our stories.